The History of Philosophy, Modern Philosophy, Kant to the Present. Lecture 5.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, let us begin. Our subject this evening is the wave of irrationalism, the wave of anti-reason that swept through 19th century German philosophy as a result of the influence of Kant and Hegel. Tonight we're going to look at three philosophers who represent three somewhat different versions of this general irrationalism. In the first half this evening I want to look briefly at Schopenhauer and then at Nietzsche, and then after the break at Karl Marx. Now you may think on the basis of what we've said in the last few weeks that irrationalism has already reached its climax in philosophy, and that when you reach Hegel there's no further place to go. If you recall the dialectic process, every concept involves its own contradictory, and as soon as it generates that contradictory, the two are immediately aufgehoben in a synthesis, which both abolishes and preserves the contradiction, so it's there and it isn't there at the end. This viewpoint representing an open, complete abandonment of the law of contradiction. And you would think that's as far as irrationalism could go. I point out to you, however, that Hegel did not claim to be an irrationalist. If you recall, he called the faculty which grasps the dialectic laws of the universe, he called that faculty reason, and he claimed to be a staunch advocate of reason. He constantly declared that reason, as he defined it, could know reality, that reality was rational in his sense, and so on. In effect, Hegel's response to Kant was to say, Kant misunderstood what reason is. If we redefine reason as a dialectic faculty, then I'll show you that reality is knowable by reason. Now, this position, of course, is actually a profound irrationalism because it abandons Aristotelian logic and endorses contradictions on principle, but it's somewhat concealed in that Hegel called the dialectic faculty reason. And therefore, he is officially, by historians of philosophy, he is officially, even if ridiculously, classified as a rationalist. There is, however, another much more openly irrational type of response to Kant that took place in the 19th century. Instead of allegedly reconceiving reason to show that reason could know reality in the Hegelian fashion, many philosophers took the following line. They said, Kant is right. Reason cannot know reality. It's restricted only to the phenomenal world, the world of appearances. But, they said, that doesn't mean that reality is unknowable. How do we get out of this problem? How does reality become knowable if not by reason? Well, all we have to do is say that man has another cognitive faculty, a non-rational or anti-rational cognitive faculty. Something in him that is not sense perception, not logic, not reason, not intellect, something deeper and more profound than any of these, and that something can grasp true reality even if reason cannot. Now, an approach of this sort, which would be a direct reaction or development from the Kantian view, would lead to an avowed irrationalism, an open, unconcealed statement that reason is no good and we have a non-rational means of knowledge. And this particular approach was very widespread during the 19th century throughout Europe, particularly so in Germany, owing to the influence of Kant. In fact, this type of approach, if you recall our discussions of Kant, was suggested by Kant himself. If you remember, according to Kant, we had a certain access to the noumenal world by non-rational means, by faith. Remember, we could have faith in God, freedom, and immortality. Kant, however, himself had been pretty tentative in his claims about what we could garner about the noumenal world. And while he said that we could have faith in certain things about it, he always clung to his position that in itself it was unknowable. But nevertheless, he had suggested this lead. Even if he himself was hesitant to follow it up to the full, the lead, namely, that something other than reason might have access to true reality. Well, the 19th century irrationalists that we are now going to look at followed up this lead to the hilt without any of Kant's reservations. Now, they're given a special name. This group of 19th century avowed irrationalists are called romanticists. Romanticists. Now, this is not a term used in the same way in which we talk about romantic art. It's a completely different phenomenon. If you're interested in what romanticism in art means, I refer you to Ayn Rand's article, What is Romanticism? We are here using romanticism as a term to describe a certain type of 19th century irrationalism, a specifically philosophic, not aesthetic or artistic doctrine. And the romanticist's credo was there is something deeper, more important in man than reason. Reason is a false, secondary, superficial faculty. It has, to be sure, they would concede, some practical value in dealing with the phenomenal world, the world of appearances, but it doesn't penetrate to true reality. Well, what does? Well, what is left when reason is abandoned? Now, you might think that these people would appeal to revelations from God, but appeals to God had generally been on the wane, on the decline since the Renaissance. God really never survived the Renaissance. Progressively, as the centuries went by, religion was more and more on the defensive, and although to some extent you find in the romanticist philosophers appeal to revelation and appeal to a religious type of approach, on the whole that is not their essential or distinctive characteristic. Their typical answer to the question, what is it that is our means of knowledge of reality, was not revelation from God, but our passion, our feeling, our instinct, our intuition, our subconscious, in a word, our emotion, our feeling. So the romanticists were the poets and philosophers of the 19th century who openly revolted against reason in the name of the supremacy of passion and emotion, of some avowedly non-rational means of knowledge. Now, it was common to put the same point that I've just made in a somewhat different terminology. Instead of talking about the dichotomy of reason versus the passions, these same philosophers often talked about the intellect versus the will. The intellect versus the will. And it comes to essentially the same distinction as reason versus the passions. The intellect they construed as the rational faculty, and they thought of it as a calm, quiet, cool, detached, passionless element in man. The will, on the other hand, designated, so to speak, the executive portion of the human personality, the part of man underlying and representing his feelings and his actions. That's which makes him go out and do things. And according to them, what makes you go out and do things is your feelings, your desires, your strivings, your yearnings, your cravings, your passions. Now, that whole gestalt of all those types of wild, surging feeling is generally what's referred to when these people talk about the will. Now, if we use this terminology, we can say that most of the Romanticist philosophers spoke of man's will as being more basic than his intellect. They said this will was the real force, a profoundly irrational force at the heart of human nature, driving men to act. On this kind of view, all human beings are inherently irrational. They don't act in accordance with reason, no matter what self-deceptions they may tell themselves. They've got good reasons for what they do, but the real source of their behavior is this surging, teeming, driving non-rational passions and impulses at the core of their being. Now, those romanticists who exalted passion above reason, using the will terminology, are called voluntarists. Voluntarists, from a Latin word meaning will. Voluntarism, in this sense, is the view that the will has primacy in man. It's more fundamental than the intellect. Voluntarism is the particular form of irrationalism which exalts the so-called will at the expense of the intellect, and it was very common during the Romanticist period, as we'll see. Now, against this general background as introduction, let's take a brief look at one very archetypical romanticist, voluntarist philosopher of the period, very influential on subsequent ones, Arthur Schopenhauer. His dates are 1788 to 1860. He begins, in effect, by essentially agreeing with Kant. Our senses, our reason, our intellect are cognitively inadequate, they're inferior, they're limited to surface truths, they merely give us the world as it appears to us. They merely give us the phenomenal world to which they're limited. According to Schopenhauer, space, time, causality are our subjective mental contributions to experience. It's a very Kantian view, obviously. And therefore, by a process of sense perception or by a process of intellectual thought, we can know only the subjective effects on us of true reality. We can never penetrate to reality itself by these means. Now, he does say that reason has some practical value. It enables us to deal with the phenomenal world. He points out that it makes communication possible, it enables us to learn from experience, and so on. But none of this is of any use if our concern is insight into true reality. We don't, however, have to despair, because we can know what true reality, things in themselves, are, according to Schopenhauer. Not by reason, but by a special faculty which he calls intuition. Intuition represents a direct, non-rational insight that you have. It's completely inexplicable in rational terms. You just suddenly know at a certain point that something is true of true reality. You have like a penetrating X-ray vision into the heart of reality, and when you have it, it's self-certifying. You just know that the deliverance of this intuition is infallible. You can't understand the operation of it. You merely have a blinding feeling that you have the truth, and you just know when you have this insight that what you have is the truth, the ultimate nature of reality. Now, I have to rely upon your exercising your operation of your intuition in following what's about to come, because as Schopenhauer himself would say, he cannot make it rationally clear. So if you don't have it, you'll have to get along as best you can without it tonight. Well, what is it that intuition reveals to us about the nature of true reality? Well, says Schopenhauer, to find the nature of true reality, we have to look inside ourselves. We have to ignore and set aside the whole outer world, including, of course, our physical bodies. That's all part of the world of appearances. We have to set that aside and focus on our own inner essence. And when we do, we grasp that our essence is will. Will. W-I-L-L. We simply have an intuition that, whereas our bodies and the whole physical world are merely appearances, at our core, what constitutes our true reality is we are will. And this is an insight certified by intuition. Either you see it or you don't. As such, there's nothing I can say about it except to give you the standard mystic line on this type of point. If, to those who understand, no explanation is necessary. To those who don't understand, no explanation is possible. And in either case, therefore, I don't explain. So let us pass on. We've got this much of a foothold on reality, namely that each of us at root is a will. Well, Schopenhauer proceeds from this to generalize, to make a metaphysics out of this view, a theory of the nature of reality as such across the board. Reality, he tells us, in itself, true reality, is also will. And now you better use a capital W to indicate this, because this is a cosmic will which represents true reality. Will for him is not merely the essence of man, it's also the essence of reality metaphysically. And this is now voluntarism, the primacy of will, but raised now to a metaphysics encompassing all of reality and not simply a theory of the nature of man. True reality is will, and the world of appearance, the whole physical world, including our bodies, our brains, our minds, the whole business, is merely the expression or manifestation of will. Again, there's no proof of this. All we can do, says Schopenhauer, is say on the analogy of the one thing we directly intuit, namely our own inner core, we generalize to reality as a whole and say that it too is will. Now I introduce one further factor. For reasons similar to those that I mentioned last week when we discussed Hegel, Schopenhauer was opposed to distinctions. He was opposed to the idea that there is a real distinction between me and you, him and her, this and that. Everything he holds is ultimately one. In true reality, now this is a position that we took at under Hegel, so if you got through it last week, you can get through it this week too. In true reality, there are no distinctions. There are no separate entities. Everything is collapsed into one unitary phenomenon. In other words, if true reality is will and there are no distinctions, there are not many wills in true reality. True reality is simply one will, one cosmic striving, willing process. And the appearance of many individual human beings and physical objects, in other words, the whole phenomenal world, is merely the expression or manifestation of this one unitary world will, as we can call it. That's what true reality is. Now, you recall Hegel's view that all that exists is one cosmic mind, the absolute, and that distinctions are unreal, that all individuality and distinctions and separateness are merely a lower stage of the absolute. Well, Schopenhauer is here taking essentially the same position, only instead of saying that the world we experience is the expression of a cosmic mind, he says it's the expression of a cosmic will. But as far as we're concerned, that's only a change of terminology. Now, if you ask me, well, what is this will with a capital W like that constitutes true reality? I cannot tell you. You'd have to have an intuition. The closest I could get in describing it is to say it is some kind of single cosmic striving or craving which makes up true reality. Now, you might naively ask me, well, who is it that is striving or craving in true reality? And I'd have to answer you, nobody. Simply the process of willing. Reality is simply the process of willing without any entity doing the willing. Now here again you see obvious echoes of Heraclitus. Reality is process without entities. Only Heraclitus is almost sane in comparison to this, because at least he had the kind of processes that you could grasp. Well, now suppose you ask me, we have a willing process without a willer, which constitutes true reality. What does the will? What is its goal? What is its object? To which Schopenhauer has a clear answer. It has no goal and no object. It wills only to will. It wills, as he sometimes puts it, only to be, to live, to affirm itself. Now, I think you can see at least this point. The will, for instance, couldn't will to make a fortune, because money is only phenomenal. Money is only the expression of the will's willing activities. So in true reality, there's no money, there's no food, there's no knowledge, there's nothing that the will could will for. Anything you could name is already just a phenomenal expression of the will. In itself, in true reality, there's only a will. So obviously there's nothing that it could will, only to will. We have a will which wills only to will. And as such, says Schopenhauer, and this much we'd certainly have to agree with him on, this will is completely irrational. It's a blind, meaningless, pointless, restless, striving process that never gets anywhere or accomplishes anything, and that's the essence, core, and heart of reality. Now I quote you from one commentator who summarizes this. This commentator is Benjamin Fuller, and he has a reputation for fairness, so I quote him. The will is, quote, blind, irrational, and unmoral. It is a will to be, a will to live, no matter how. Its essence is simply to affirm itself and to appear as a world process no matter what. In such a will there is no purpose, no morality, no happiness, no good. Its motivation is insane, its fruit is suffering, and the universe created by its blind and conflicting cravings is an evil thing. Unquote. So to speak, it's a crazy, mixed up will. Now, since this will is so insane and miserable, it follows, says Schopenhauer, that the world in which we live, the world which is after all simply an expression or manifestation of this will, the world is an insane, miserable, wretched place. It follows that pain, misery, wretchedness, defeat, suffering, agony, failure are man's inevitable metaphysical destiny. That happiness on earth is completely impossible. In a word, we live in an evil, demented nightmare universe. Life is hell, and pain is our inescapable destiny. This view technically is known as metaphysical pessimism. In objectivist terms, this would be the malevolent universe viewpoint, but now raised to its orgiastic climax. Pain, according to Schopenhauer, is the only positive feeling in life. Now, what we call pleasure is simply the temporary removal of a pain. Pain is the core of human existence. Well, you may ask at this point, if this is the nature of the universe, how should I live my life? Or what should I do? In fact, you might even ask before that, why not just commit suicide? Schopenhauer considered that possibility, but he said that suicide would not really solve the problem, because suicide would merely remove one phenomenal expression of the will. It would simply remove one particular manifestation of the will, namely you, and this insane will would still be there, striving blindly and creating endless suffering. What we have to do if we are to be released from our plight in a kind of permanent metaphysical fashion is conduct a crusade against the will itself. In other words, a crusade against reality metaphysically. We must somehow get the will to extinguish itself, to break itself, to cease to will. And if we can destroy the will itself, then all of its manifestations, of course, will disappear. The whole universe will be wiped out, and we will have achieved permanent salvation. So the goal then of our ethics is an assault on metaphysical reality itself, to be achieved by breaking the will. Now you may ask, how do we do this? Well, I'm going to make a long story short. Each man, says Schopenhauer, should work to break his own will. To deny, to undercut, to attack, to stifle, to stamp out his own will to live. He should recognize that his sense of personal identity, of personal individuality, is an illusion. He should realize that his obligation is to sacrifice and renounce all of his personal desires. He should realize that life is nothing but suffering and defeat, and he should try to reach the state where he is so overcome by a feeling of the misery, hopelessness, and futility of life that he simply loses all hope, all desire, all passion, all will, and becomes a will-less, resigned, indifferent, passionless ascetic, like a Hindu mystic, in effect, who was very much admired by Schopenhauer. Now, I'll quote you a brief passage from Schopenhauer himself to let you see in what extreme terms he expresses this viewpoint. Quote, "When a man no longer makes the egotistical distinction between his person and that of others, but takes as much interest in the sufferings of other individuals as in his own, and therefore is not only benevolent in the highest degree, but even ready to sacrifice his own individuality whenever such a sacrifice will save a number of other persons, then it clearly follows that such a man who recognizes in all beings his own inmost and true self must also regard the infinite suffering of all suffering beings as his own, take on himself the pain of the whole world. Knowledge of the whole, of the nature of the thing in itself, the will, you see, which has been described, becomes a quieter of all and every volition. The will now turns away from life. It now shudders at the pleasures in which it recognizes the assertion of life. Man now attains to the state of voluntary renunciation, resignation, true indifference, and perfect willlessness. There arises within such a man a horror of the nature of which his own phenomenal existence is an expression, namely the will to live, the kernel and inner nature of that world which is recognized as full of misery. He therefore disowns this nature which appears in him and is expressed through the body, and his action gives the lie to his phenomenal existence and appears an open contradiction to it. In other words, he fights his physical body and his drives and his desires, and Schopenhauer gives this example. Quote, his body, healthy and strong, expresses through the genitals the sexual impulse. But he, the ideal man, denies the will and gives the lie to the body. He desires no sensual gratification under any condition. Voluntary and complete chastity is the first step in asceticism, or the denial of the will to live. Thus it may be that, continuing the quote for just a sentence or so more, that the inner nature of holiness, self-renunciation, mortification of our own will, asceticism, is here for the first time expressed abstractly and free from all mythical elements as denial of the will to live, appearing after the complete knowledge of its own nature has become a quieter of all volition. Now that, you see, is as explicit as you need to get a taste of Schopenhauer's approach to ethics. That, I think, gives you an ample taste. Each man must deny his will to live, renounce his own will. Now, just to finish the story, in some mysterious manner, says Schopenhauer, we can hope that by this means the will in itself, the will which constitutes true reality, will also renounce willing, cease to affirm itself, extinguish itself, and thus wipe out the whole of reality. He never makes remotely clear how metaphysical reality could turn on itself and extinguish itself, but that apparently is the hope. You might ask, what will there then be if the will wipes itself out, and therefore, of course, its phenomenal expression, the physical world, is wiped out? And the answer is there will then be nothing, pure emptiness, nirvana, borrowing a term from Oriental religion. The will be gone, all its manifestations will be gone, existence will have been dissolved. This will be our ultimate salvation. What is nirvana like? Well, since it's nothing, I can't describe it. It's beyond all speech, beyond all thought. Outside the power of the human mind to understand, it's completely ineffable. Now you see here the most rampant Oriental mysticism. Reality will stamp itself out, and nothingness will then reign supreme. The whole physical world will vanish. We will be swallowed up in nirvana, and at last we will achieve true peace, salvation, and bliss. So much for Schopenhauer. Now, I think it's entirely superfluous to comment on this. The hatred of life and existence is too obvious to need comment. You see what happens when a philosopher avowedly, consistently abandons reason across the board, as Schopenhauer did. Now let's say a few words about someone influenced by Schopenhauer, but in certain ways certainly better than Schopenhauer, namely Friedrich Nietzsche. 1844 to 1900. Now there are almost, I should say at the outset, as many interpretations of Nietzsche as there are readers of Nietzsche. He wrote primarily short essays. His work is essentially a series of disconnected aphorisms. He used an enormous amount of metaphor and symbolic phraseology, the literal meaning of which is often very unclear. He frequently changed his attitude as he grew older on a certain point. He generally asserted his isolated views without very much reasoning or argument, and many people simply dismiss him as a poet, a term of disrepute in this context, suggesting he had no real philosophic content. He certainly gives very few reasons for the views he takes. At one point in one of his famous works, Thus Spake Zarathustra, somebody asks Zarathustra, who is Nietzsche's mouthpiece in that work, why he holds a certain view, and Zarathustra says, "Why? You ask me why? I am not one of those who may be asked about their why." And that is generally true of Nietzsche. You can't ask him why. Now, the upshot of this disconnected and non-rational method of philosophizing is that we have from Nietzsche a series of rather disconnected observations, not integrated into any coherent systematic philosophy. If you look at the main branches of philosophy and try to classify Nietzsche's view, you run into trouble constantly. For instance, he did develop certain metaphysical and epistemological theories quite late in his life, but they are more in the nature of an afterthought rather than the actual foundation of his philosophy. As for ethics, that's the most famous part of his philosophy, his view of how man should live and his view of human nature, but it's extremely unsystematic. The key concepts he uses, as we'll see, are quite poorly defined. And as for politics, he has no particular political viewpoint. In some incredibly loose sense of the term, he's pro-individualist. He's certainly anti-statist. One of his aphorisms is, "The state is the coldest of all cold monsters." But he is certainly not pro-capitalist. He's very anti-capitalist. Capitalism is for him a prosaic bourgeois system, and he simply dismisses that with scorn, so he has effectively no politics at all. Now, the result of this kind of mishmash is that he has been taken by an enormous diversity of people who seize on certain aspects of him, and they take him as their heir. So, for instance, he's been championed as an individualist, and you can find passages that sound individualistic in him. On the other hand, he's also been taken over by the Nazis and fascists who claimed him to be one of their fathers, and they could quote certain passages that sounded as though they gave a basis to Nazism. Some people have interpreted him as an advocate of reason, and there are certain pro-reason aphorisms and passages, and others as an avowed irrationalist. Today's existentialists frequently cite him as one of their ancestors because they find passages in him where he says life is meaningless and man is tortured and tragic. But you can also find passages in him in which he champions human greatness and the joy of life on earth. You can find all these elements in him. In a sense, therefore, Nietzsche is like the Bible is supposed to be. He's all things to all men. One philosopher, Jaspers, went so far as to declare that the essence of Nietzsche is that he systematically contradicts anything he says. Now, I think this is too much, but there is certainly an element of that present in Nietzsche, so I qualify my presentation by telling you I'm picking just a few typical elements. First, I'm going to say a few words about the kind of metaphysical epistemological ideas that Nietzsche hinted at in places, and then we'll look at some of his key ethical ideas. Now, the first thing to say is that there were certainly large elements of romanticism and voluntarism in Nietzsche and in his philosophy. He is not a typical romanticist voluntarist in this respect, not like Schopenhauer. There still is a certain respect for reason and intellect in Nietzsche. But there are many obvious romanticist voluntarist elements. For instance, to give you one of the most famous, he distinguishes two basically different opposed elements in human nature, which he names after two Greek gods, Apollo and Dionysus. Apollo, you know, for the Greeks was the god that represented calmness, balance, order, harmony, cool rationality, in effect the intellect, the reason. Dionysus was a god in the ancient world worshipped by frenzied dancing, intoxication, orgiastic rites, violent, unleashed demonic passions. Now, for Nietzsche, each of us has, in effect, one of these two elements in us at our core. We have an Apollonian, a rational, intellectual element, and we have this frenzied, demoniacal, Dionysian element. In effect, this passion, wild frenzy at the core of our makeup. And this, you see, is Nietzsche's version of the intellect-will dichotomy. The Dionysian element is really simply Nietzsche's version of the will. Now, Nietzsche, I may say for accuracy, wavers on this question. Sometimes he suggests we should try to bring these two elements into some sort of harmony or reconciliation, but very often, and progressively as he grows older, he casts his lot with the Dionysian element. He says that is the best, the noblest, the highest element in man, and it should be nourished, pumped up, exalted, expressed. It, above all, should not have its wild, drunken spontaneity inhibited by the operation of merciless logic, cold intellect, you know, the cold hand of reason, etc. You know that line. And there's a strong Dionysus worship in Nietzsche, which represents, obviously, an extreme irrationalism, romanticism, voluntarism. At one point, for instance, Nietzsche is discussing the fall of ancient Greece, a civilization that he very much admired in many ways, and he ascribes that fall, of all things, to Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle. And why are they the ones responsible for the fall of ancient Greece? Because they insisted on searching for logical reasons to explain everything. And the result was, according to Nietzsche, they destroyed the wild spontaneity of the Dionysian element, which was Greece's strength. They introduced the cold, corroding hand of intellect. They kept asking why, you see, instead of realizing you shouldn't act why, but act on this burst of passion. And therefore, Greece's inner strength was undermined, and it fell. Well, it gives you a taste of the kind of irrationalism and voluntarism you can find in Nietzsche. He often writes, to give you one more example, as though reason and logic don't give us the true nature of reality. Maybe, he suggests at certain points, the law of cause and effect, even the laws of logic, the law of identity and contradiction, are merely ways of thinking bred into us by a long evolutionary process and don't reflect reality at all. And then when he takes this line, he tends to say our reasoning, while it may be practically necessary to life, may in fact yield only false conclusions. Now, if you want an example of his irrationalism, he will go on at this point to say that's fine with him. He has no objections to false conclusions. He's all in favor of false conclusions. And I quote you a brief passage from him to this effect. Quote, I quote this just as an example of the kind of avowed irrationalism you can find in Nietzsche. Quote, the falseness of an opinion is not for us any objection to it. Now, what do you say when somebody says that? That's me, interchanging. Continuing the quote from Nietzsche, it is here perhaps that our new language sounds most strangely. The question is how far an opinion is life-furthering, life-preserving, species-preserving, perhaps species-rearing. The renunciation of false opinions would be a renunciation of life, a negation of life. To recognize untruth as a condition of life, this is certainly to impugn the traditional ideas of value in a dangerous manner, and a philosophy which ventures to do so has thereby alone placed itself beyond good and evil. Unquote. Now that's just a few samples from Nietzsche. There are many more anti-reason voluntarist elements in him, but none of it is consistently worked out. I should mention also, for fairness, that there are some isolated pro-reason passages. You will find places in Nietzsche, for instance, where he criticizes Christianity scathingly because it abandons reason in favor of faith. So he is not even a consistent opponent of reason. Now, no one could put on the scales all the anti-rational and the pro-rational sentences, aphorisms, and passages, and exactly how measure exactly how much of each element there is in him. All you can say is that in general, the irrationalist element dominates progressively as Nietzsche grows older. And in general, and with, I think, a great deal of validity, Nietzsche is commonly classed as an irrationalist. Now let's take a brief look at his metaphysics, his view of reality. Once a philosopher exalts something above reason and intellect, then, of course, as far as his characterization of reality goes, it's pretty much deuces wild. What is reality for Nietzsche? Well, he takes his lead here from Schopenhauer. He takes over from Schopenhauer the idea that reality is essentially will. And again, there's no proof attempted for this. It's just simply outrightly asserted. But there is this difference between Nietzsche and Schopenhauer. Nietzsche is, in some sense, an individualist. He did not want to reduce all of us to one cosmic super will. He did not want to deny individuality and say it was unreal, as Schopenhauer and Hegel have done. So he said reality is not one will, but many. A huge number of wills, each ceaselessly willing. And each of us and the whole physical world is simply the manifestation of these ceaselessly willing wills. Well, what, you ask me again, do these wills will? And I don't want to spend very much time on this. You can imaginatively project what would you do if you were a will and you were surrounded by a whole host of other alien wills. Well, what could such a will do but a will to overpower the other wills? That, in any event, is what Nietzsche reports. Each of these wills desires to affirm itself over the others. These wills are in ceaseless conflict and strife. Each wills ceaselessly to expand its power over the others. In his famous terminology, each is a will to power, a will to power. Reality is a series of clashing wills, each striving to dominate the others. Now, as a metaphysics, this is not too important. It is really just too nonsensical to warrant further discussion. And as I say, it was elaborated more when Nietzsche was late in life, later as he developed, and it's more in the nature of an afterthought. But it'll give us the framework to understand Nietzsche's analysis of human nature, at least. Man, he says, and in fact all living organisms, by their nature, are run by one basic drive, and that is the will to power, the will to power. All human behavior, he claims, can be explained on this basis. All human behavior, all animate behavior, is simply the expression on the human living level of the basic metaphysical constitution of reality, namely, that the essence of reality is a series of wills to power. I may mention here parenthetically that to some extent Nietzsche was here influenced by the development of the Darwinian evolutionist viewpoint. You know, of course, that Darwinism, the evolutionary theory, was the big new development in the 19th century, and every philosopher was rushing to incorporate it in some way or another into his philosophy. And the Darwinists put forth the view that there is a limit on the amount of food, that the offspring of a particular species are therefore necessarily locked in a mortal combat with one another to see which will survive. There is an inherent struggle for existence, as they put it. The essence of life is a clash of each organism trying to get what it needs for survival at the price of the others. And of course, in the famous expression, who is it that survives in this process? The fit, thus the survival of the fittest. Now that sort of view is definitely present in Nietzsche in places, and although he's critical of much of the ideas of the Darwinists, the idea of life metaphysically as being a clash, a struggle, a war of one organism against the other, of life as being a conquest of competitors, is taken over by him essentially, and is one of the elements feeding this view of man as being basically a will to power. Well, says Nietzsche, since this is the way man is, since this is the way life is, since this is the way reality is, we have to embrace it joyfully and express our wills to power uninhibitedly and unashamedly. It gives you the key, the clue that he's going to take a different view than Schopenhauer. Schopenhauer having the view that the world was horrified and wanted to extinguish it, but Nietzsche wants to affirm it, as we'll see. Well, the question is, what do you do to affirm it? What does it mean to affirm the will to power? What sort of power is it that one should develop or express? Which we need to know at the minimum to make get some clear idea what Nietzsche means by saying you should go out and express your will to power. Now, I may say that the term power, like every other key term in Nietzsche, is undefined. It's very loosely used. You can find a whole bunch of different meanings in it. I'll give you some of the key ingredients that he oscillates between from work to work or passage to passage, and you'll see why Nietzsche is such an enormous mixture. Sometimes Nietzsche seems to think of power simply as brute physical power, brute physical force. On this view, when you say every man is dominated by or consists of a will to power, you mean every man is basically, in effect, a brute physical power luster at heart. Now, I can give you a series of quotes from Nietzsche, which I will, just a few brief ones to give you the idea of this view of power as physical, sometimes political domination over others. For instance, here's a passage where he's describing the nature of life. Quote, "Here one must think profoundly to the very basis and resist all sentimental weakness. Life itself is essentially appropriation, injury, conquest of the strange and weak, suppression, severity, obtrusion of peculiar forms, incorporation, and at the least putting it mildest, exploitation. Exploitation does not belong to a depraved or imperfect and primitive society. It belongs to the nature of the living being as a primary organic function," unquote. That's from Beyond Good and Evil, you see, and it gives you a picture of the will to power as an exploiting, physicalistic power luster. And frequently Nietzsche will talk about some group of men that he approves of, call them aristocrats, and say, in a very approving context, that they are barbarians, and that is a great thing. So, for instance, here's a quote. He's talking about certain aristocratic races he admires, and he says, quote, this is from the Genealogy of Morals, quote, "It is impossible not to recognize at the core of all these aristocratic races the beast of prey, the magnificent blonde brute, avidly rampant for spoil and victory. This hidden core needed an outlet from time to time. The beast must get loose again, must return into the wilderness," unquote. You get the idea. And there are passages in Nietzsche where he seems to glorify war and certain military conquerors, and of course the Nazis loved the passage about the magnificent blonde brutes. So if you interpret power in this way, it suggests that according to Nietzsche, men are essentially motivated by the desire physically to trample upon other men and to physically crush, destroy, exploit, subjugate. But there is another way you could look at power in Nietzsche, and again you can find passages illustrating it. In many cases he thinks of power not in this kind of brute physical terms, but in what we could think of as indirect psychological terms. And the closest I can describe this is to ask you to imagine the way, for instance, now this is me speaking, not Nietzsche, but the way a non-violent social metaphysician would seek power. In other words, seek to impress himself on others, to bend them to his will by a variety of non-violent, non-physical, non-political means. Nietzsche gives the example, for instance, one out of a great many, that a man may want nothing but to create a magnificent symphony. Now, on the face of it, he doesn't want power at all, and yet, says Nietzsche, what is really motivating him down deep is the desire to outdo others, to excel others, to overpower others by means of his great achievement. And I can give you a brief quote from Nietzsche on this point. Quote, Even when he who strives for excellence wanted to make a delightful impression, he did not enjoy this success insofar as he thus delighted his neighbor, but insofar as he impressed himself on the soul of another, changed its form, and ruled over it according to his will. The striving for excellence, now get this sentence, the striving for excellence is the striving to overwhelm one's neighbor, even if only very indirectly or only in one's own feelings or even dreams. There is a long line of degrees of this secretly desired overwhelming, and a complete list of these would almost amount to a history of culture, unquote. So there's another form of the will to power, which can take a whole variety of forms, but not necessarily manifest itself in crude, physical, blatant type expression. In both of these types, however, he is still using power in an essentially social sense. Power is still power over others. And on this, either of these view of power, power means inflicting your will on other people, either in crudely physical terms or indirectly psychologically. I should mention, however, that there's still a third sense of power in Nietzsche. Very often he construes it in a completely different way. And you could compile a series of passages in which he construes the ideal man, the man who expresses the will to power, as a completely independent, self-sufficient being, who is in no way motivated by the desire to overpower others at all, either physically or psychologically. Now, when Nietzsche speaks of the will to power, in the case of such men, he seems to mean by power something like metaphysical efficacy. In effect, the power to live fully and successfully, the power to deal with reality and achieve your values in it. The sort of power, in effect, that you would say a man of true self-esteem has, a man who is potent, you see, efficacious, creative, independent, happy. Now, as I say, there's that element all intermixed with the others. And when he writes this way and glorifies the man of power, there often emerges a portrait of a man that an objectivist could validly admire, and that is very radically different from the blonde brutes and social metaphysical power lusters that elsewhere qualify as the men with the will to power. Now, because power is never clearly defined by Nietzsche, because he oscillates back and forth, the result is that his view is an enormous, gigantic package deal. Often what he describes as the man with the will to power is an admirable man. Often he is despicable, and it's all lumped together, sometimes in the very same work and in the very same aphorism. All right, let's go on. We got, says Nietzsche, two basic types of men in the world. We're all confronted by the facts of the universe, by the fact that man's nature and the universe is a will to power. We're confronted by the fact that life requires the expansion and development of strength, of power, that life is a struggle, a challenge, a war, we could say, in which each of us have to fight for victory, for power, however it's being defined. Well, says Nietzsche, in the face of these facts about the nature of man and life and reality, there are two types of men who have two completely different types of attitude. On the one hand, there are those who look reality in the face and say, yes, that's the way the universe and life and man is. I accept it gladly, joyfully, willingly. I embrace my nature. I say yes to what life and reality requires. And these, of course, are for Nietzsche the good men. He calls them variously the strong, the yea-sayers, see, those who say yes to life, and frequently calls them the superman, or the superman. He calls them superman because he thinks of the mass of humanity as being weaklings, and the superman is kind of the ideal man in relation to the mass of humanity. Nietzsche says somewhere that the superman is to the normal kind of man what the normal man is to the ape. He is that stage of development where he fully is willing to affirm life and reality. On On the other hand, we have the weaklings, those who are frightened by life and its challenges, those who are frustrated in the attempt to develop their power, those who feel that they failed, those who are terrified, and whose solution is to turn against life and man and reality, the ones, in effect, who look at the universe and shudder with horror and say, no. They are what Nietzsche calls the naysayers. You see, we have the yay-sayers versus the naysayers. They are the weaklings. They are the slave mentalities, as he calls them. And, of course, an arch candidate here would be Schopenhauer, who said no as vociferously as you could say it. Now, if you ask me for a description of either type, I will give you a description by simply giving you a sort of random list of virtues and vices compiled from various writings of Nietzsche. He nowhere attempts any systematic presentation or development of what are the virtues of the yay-sayer or the Superman versus the naysayer, because, of course, the whole thing is so aphoristic, and because his very concept of power is itself so undefined. You will see that many of the things that I say about the yay-sayers are going to be very generalized, so that you don't know exactly what Nietzsche means. However, as you'll see, there are many good, even if very generalized, qualities on this list. Now, here is, so to speak, a thumbnail sketch of the yay-sayer, the Superman. Well, he's the man who lives deeply, richly, passionately, exuberantly, intensely. He is strong, self-assertive, highly confident, magnanimous, proud. He has a definite sense of rank and of his own worth, his own value. He's an aristocrat. He's independent. There's a kind of vitality coursing through him. He has, needless to say, an overriding contempt for the naysayers, for the weak. He is aloof and haughty. He's daring. One of Nietzsche's famous lines, of course, is that we must live dangerous. And the yaysayer certainly lives up to this maxim. He is through and through an individual. He's a man of passion, but, says Nietzsche, in places at least, he's cultured and creative. And he's best embodied, in effect, in the great, lonely, creative geniuses of history. And above all, of course, he is an egoist. Nietzsche was all for egoism. Now, if you ask me for his concept of egoism, I have to tell you that it is as thorough a mixture of alien elements as is his concept of power. You could compile passages from Nietzsche according to which an egoist is rationally conceived as a man that has true self-esteem, that is motivated by his own valid, creative, independent ends. And if you took those sentences out of context, you'd say Nietzsche's a good egoist in the right sense of the term. On the other hand, of course, when some of the other concepts of power are operating, then egoist for Nietzsche emerges as an exploiter, one who sacrifices others, who uses them ruthlessly for his means. Both these views of egoism are inextricably fused in Nietzsche. He tells us, for instance, at one point that the Superman, the great creative genius, is the end and the aim and justification of history, and that he has therefore a right to treat the weaklings as slaves and exploit them for his own purposes. And that's all pushed forth as simply egoism. Needless to say that, of course, this idea of sacrificing others is the exact opposite of what a true egoist in the objectivist sense would do, but in Nietzsche it's all part of one package. So much for the yay-sayer. On the other hand, we have the naysayers, the weaklings. And they, in effect, are the exact opposite. These are the bad, the evil men. What are they like? They're weak, frightened. They huddle in groups. They're afraid to affirm their individuality. They try to conform, to belong. They love to join clubs. They're meek, timid, exhausted, passionless, apathetic, humble creatures. They engage in self-denial, and they preach self-denial. They beg. One of the surest signs of a naysayer for Nietzsche is somebody who goes around preaching pity and sympathy and compassion, begging for people to love him and forgive him, preaching renunciation, etc. In other words, in sum, the naysayers, the slave mentalities, are broken, spiritless, apathetic creatures unable to face up to life. Now, the weak, the naysayers, said Nietzsche, hate the strong. They hate the strong for their character and achievements. They resent the strong. They want to keep the strong down. They want to bring them down to their own level in order to ameliorate the guilt that the naysayers themselves feel. And therefore, what they do is to preach as virtues all of the qualities which they, the naysayers themselves, possess, and they denounce as vices all of the qualities of the strong, of the naysayers. In other words, they completely upturn the right code of values. Instead of affirming the qualities, the virtues of the naysayer, they affirm as good, they seize control of morality. They turn it against the naysayers, and they pretend that the good is all of their particular vices, compassion and weakness and feebleness and fear, etc. And they pretend that vice is what really is virtue. Now, what we have to do, says Nietzsche, is completely upturn the whole code of evaluations, which he calls transvaluation of values. We must transvaluate values, completely reverse them, so that the qualities of the naysayer are affirmed, the qualities of the naysayer are denied. How is it, by what means do the naysayers do this? Well, for instance, they're frightened of life, and so they denounce it. They say life on earth is no good, and they speak of virtue as being obedience to God, or lusting after another world, nirvana, or heaven, whatever it happens to be. They're frightened, the naysayers, of bodily passions, so they preach asceticism and self-denial. They're frightened of independence and standing alone, so they preach that you should love everyone. They're frightened of affirming themselves, embracing themselves, pursuing their own goals, so they preach self-sacrifice, selflessness, love thy neighbor, altruism, etc. Now, what philosophy is it, in terms of major influence on the West, that best expresses this naysaying attitude to life? Well, obviously, Christianity. And Nietzsche was therefore violently opposed to Christianity. In his view, it's anti-life, anti-this earth, anti-man, anti-happiness, anti-pride, anti-self, anti-will to power. And when I say he was violently opposed to Nietzsche, one thing you can say about him is that he did not equivocate. When he took a viewpoint, his Dionysian element made sure that he expressed it in the most unequivocal terms. I'll take just a moment to read you one passage in which he expresses his view of Christianity, and you will see that whatever you accuse him of, you cannot say that he is a timid compromiser. Quote, I regard Christianity as the most fatal and seductive lie that has ever yet existed. How's that for an opening? As the greatest and most impious lie, I can discern the last sprouts and branches of its ideal beneath every form of disguise. I decline to enter into any compromise or false position in reference to it. I urge people to declare open war with it. I'm continuing the quote. The morality of paltry people as the measure of all things. This is the most repugnant kind of degeneracy that civilization has ever yet brought into existence. And this kind of ideal is hanging still under the name of God over men's heads. 2 exclamation points. One more paragraph. However modest one's demands may be concerning intellectual cleanliness, when one touches the New Testament, one cannot help experiencing a sort of inexpressible feeling of discomfort. For the unbounded cheek with which the least qualified people will have their say in its pages. In regard to the greatest problems of existence, and claim to sit in judgment on such matters exceeds all limits. The impudent levity with which the most unwieldy problems are spoken of here, life, the world, God, the purpose of life, as if they were not problems at all, but the most simple things which these little bigots know all about. I thought you'd like that. Unquote. You see, that is clear cut. Now, as is always the case with Nietzsche, his attacks on Christianity are an enormous mixture. There are many points that objectivists could fully agree with and read with relish, and others that are abhorrent, depending, of course, on what concept of power or egoism, etc., he's using at the time. But I'd like to give you just a few of the better aphorisms from Nietzsche to give you a sense of the kind of good points you could find in him. I think you would find him enjoyable to read, even though he is an incredible mixture, still certainly more enjoyable than just about anybody else we cover in this course, because you can find a good number of individual sentences, isolated points, even though there's no consistent context for them. For instance, I'll read you just a few of the sort of things you could find in Zarathustra, and you get an idea of the sort of observations which pop up here and there, all intermingled with, of course, gross irrationalism, but they come out every once in a while, and they're very nice when you find them. For instance, from Zarathustra, this is a few brief excerpt from a passage called On Love of the Neighbor. You see, the Christian virtue that you should love thy neighbor. Quote, "You crowd around your neighbor and have fine words for it. But I say unto you, your love of the neighbor is your bad love of yourselves. You flee to your neighbor from yourselves and would like to make a virtue out of that. But I see through your, quote, selflessness. The you is older than the I. The you has been pronounced holy, but not yet the I. So man crowds toward his neighbor. You invite a witness when you want to speak well of yourselves. And when you have seduced him to think well of you, then you think well of yourselves. One man goes to his neighbor because he seeks himself, another because he would lose himself. Your bad love of yourselves turns your solitude into a prison," unquote. You see, and it's very, very good, beautifully expressed material there. Here's another brief one indicating the general this-worldliness of Nietzsche, also from Zarathustra. He's exhorting human beings not to be taken in by the supernaturalists and the other world and so on. He says, quote, "Remain faithful to the earth, my brothers, with the power of your virtue. Let your gift-giving love and your knowledge serve the meaning of the earth. Thus I beg and beseech you. Do not let them fly away from earthly things and beat with their wings against eternal walls. Alas, there has always been so much virtue that has flown away. Lead back to the earth the virtue that flew away as I do. Back to the body, back to life, that it may give the earth a meaning, a human meaning," unquote. See the idea being we've got to now be faithful to life on earth. However, he construed that rather than in the supernaturalistic fashion. Of course, one of his famous aphorisms is, "God is dead." He was the originator of that. And it must now be man, the great man in his achievements, that gives life its meaning and significance. And in this respect, you can find a very pro-man, pro-this earth element in Nietzsche, with, of course, typical contradictions in his concept of what man and life on earth should be. I'll read you just a couple more brief lines from Nietzsche. Here's one regarding Christianity. Quote, "They have called God what was contrary to them and gave them pain. They did not know how to love their God except by crucifying man," unquote. You see, a brilliantly expressed aphorism for his view. And one last one on original sin, which I can't resist quoting you, which of course he rejects. Quote, "As long as there have been men, man has felt too little joy. That alone, my brothers, is our original sin," unquote. I think that gives you just a brief hint of the type of thing you could find in Nietzsche. all, as I say, mixed in with enormous errors, Dionysian passion, and voluntarist type of irrationalism. A few last points, and then we can leave Nietzsche. Sometimes he expresses his view by saying that he doesn't advocate a new code of good and evil, but he is advocating something which is, quote, beyond good and evil, of course, the title of one of his famous works. That his ideal man now dispenses with good and evil entirely and acts on a completely different basis. Now, of course, by the sheer use of such an expression as beyond good and evil, he concedes morality to Christianity, you see. He concedes it to the very religionists. He concedes that they are right in specifying what good and evil consist of. And, of course, once he has done that, he's given away the case. Once you say, in effect, down with morality, then the question is, how do you decide by what means to act? You no longer have a code of values. You are led into the position simply of the subjectivist who says, I feel it, I want it, and therefore I'm going to do it. And the justification of my doing it is the intensity of my desire. Now, there is a large element of that in Nietzsche. And in objectivist shorthand, we frequently refer to someone when the occasion arises as a Nietzschean whim worshipper. See, the type of person who, in the name of individuality, dispenses with reason, with an objective code of values, and simply acts on the basis of his feelings, his Dionysian element. There's a strong element of that in Nietzsche. Finally, I'd like to point out to you there is a strong deterministic element in Nietzsche. Which camp you're in, whether in the yay-sayers or the naysayers, is determined apparently by the kind of capacities given you by nature. And apparently, sometimes he even says given you by your blood. In other words, not all men can be yay-sayers or ideal men. Most of them are intrinsically weak, and that is simply their fate. Well, of course, when you bring in this deterministic element, it undercuts and destroys the whole moral significance of the distinction, and it all but divides men into two species. And therefore it's commonly said, and this is correct as he presented, that his ethics is not really a morality for man as such, but only for a few select favored ones, because on his view the majority of men are doomed to their naysaying status. Now, you will still hear this view around, and I bet you have encountered it, because if you ever go out and preach to someone that man should be independent, he should be egoistic, he should stand on his own, and so on, today you will, I'm sure, hear someone tell you, well, that's all fine, but most men can't live that way. Most men are too weak. Your ethics, you'll hear, is not for man, but for Superman, you see. Well, if you get that kind of response, that is a Nietzschean legacy. And it's one of the things, of course, that objectivists have to fight constantly. And it has the effect of preventing Nietzsche's ethics, even whatever good points there are in it, from having any influence, because the whole thing is then determined. To summarize then on Nietzsche, his philosophy is a series of rather disconnected observations with many good points that you'd agree with, many dreadful ones, the whole put forth as a kind of package deal, and of course it's gone on as a package deal to this day. Now, objectivists, as you undoubtedly know, are sometimes called Nietzscheans by uninformed commentators or observers. If somebody tells you that you are a Nietzschean when you are advocating objectivism, the answer is you're not. I hope this presentation made clear. Across the board on all fundamentals, objectivism is completely different from Nietzscheanism. In metaphysics, we certainly do not subscribe to a world of surging wills, but a rational, logical, solid, firm existence which exists, obeys the laws of logic, obeys the law of cause and effect. In epistemology, objectivism advocates the senses and reason as man's only means of knowledge. No Dionysian passions, so it's super non-rational insights. In ethics, of course, rationality is the highest virtue for objectivism, and individual rights is a fundamental feature of the objectivist ethics, the respect for individual rights, and of course, you know the objectivist concept of egoism, of the concept of rational self-interest. Remember Galt's oath, he would swear by his life that he won't sacrifice for others nor expect others to sacrifice for him. In politics, of course, objectivism is laissez-faire capitalist. So that on all of these fundamentals in every branch of philosophy, there is a diametric opposition between objectivism and Nietzscheanism. The so-called agreement, in quotes, between objectivism and Nietzsche is only in those passages which, in a general, unsystematized, undefined way, breathe a kind of pro-man, pro-life, pro-this earth spirit. In this latter, very generalized, limited sense, there is a kinship. But this pro-life element in Nietzsche is so often contradicted, so often mixed with irrationalism, whim worship, power lust, and so on, that you would have to say, as a final verdict, Nietzscheanism as an overall philosophy is fundamentally antithetical to objectivism. All right, let us take our break now. All right, let us turn to the last of the three philosophers we're going to cover this evening, Karl Marx, 1818 to 1883. And he is, of course, the founder, patron saint of the contemporary communist movement. Now, Marx is primarily an economist, a social historian, a political agitator. He is not particularly interested in metaphysics and epistemology, and he formulated no basic new concepts in these philosophic realms. He is not, therefore, in any sense, a major philosopher. What he does is borrow from previous philosophers, most obviously and particularly from Hegel, as we'll see. He borrows from them certain basic metaphysical concepts to form the foundation for his social and economic views, which are of most importance to him. And in particular, he borrows from these previous philosophers in order to lay down the foundation of a certain interpretation of human history. So I want to look first briefly at his metaphysics, and then at the social and political implications that he derived from it, including his view of human history. Now, his metaphysics has a famous name. It is called dialectical materialism. Dialectical materialism. That's the name of Marx's metaphysics. It has two words in it, dialectical and materialism, and each of those designate certain aspects of his view of the nature of reality. Let's look at each of those terms in order. And first of all, what is a materialist? Before we get to a dialectical type of materialism. Now, materialism in general is a view about the nature of reality that goes all the way back to ancient Greece. It has had representatives in Greece in the Renaissance period, in the 17th century, in the 18th, and the 19th, so you don't have to be a communist to be a materialist. In a broad sense, materialism is the view that reality is basically or essentially material or physical in nature. That reality is, in essence or at root, only matter in motion. Now, what this means becomes more clear if you consider what it is that materialists reject. What particular views about reality do they reject? And you will then see more clearly what they mean by saying reality is basically matter. There are three things in particular that it's worth pointing out here. To begin with, and obviously, materialists are atheists. They reject the existence of God. God, of course, is not supposed to be physical. You can't travel to him in a spaceship. He doesn't have any weight or density. He's not matter in motion. And therefore, the idea of a non-physical, spiritual being who is the creator or the ruler of the universe is incompatible with the materialist metaphysics and therefore is rejected. Secondly, I'll give you these in no particular order, but just to number the items. Materialists reject free will. Because only minds can have choice. Only my mind, your mind, her mind, his mind. If all that exists is matter, if that's the fundamental reality, well, of course, matter as such is completely determined by physical laws. If reality is physical, then it must be deterministic. What we call minds and their activities, on this view, will have to be construed as simply determined consequences or byproducts of matter in motion. We cannot any longer construe minds as entities capable of initiating free, self-generated choices. We'll have to abolish the category of volition and say that what we call mental processes are simply determined results of physical action, physical phenomena. And thirdly, a related point but worth mentioning separately, materialists deny what we can call the causal efficacy of thought. They deny what we can call the causal efficacy of thought. That is to say, they hold that thought, a man's ideas, his beliefs, and so on, has no influence on his physical action, on his behavior. What a man thinks is determined by physical forces on this view. So that it's not the case that your thoughts, your ideas, your value judgments, your conclusions determine your physical actions. Because you see, if they held that sort of view, they would be saying that something mental, something in the mind, originates and causes action in the physical world. And that would be incompatible with the view that reality is at root matter. It would be incompatible with the view that mental activities are merely passive byproducts of physical forces, which is essential to a materialist view. As one materialist, not Marx, put it to express his view of the inefficacy of mental processes, he compared mental processes in relation to the body as the steam given off by a locomotive to the locomotive. The locomotive is a self-operating system. It gives off this steam as a waste byproduct. The steam doesn't run the locomotive or have any effect on its operation. It's simply a waste byproduct. Well, for a materialist in general, what we call mental processes are simply waste byproducts of the operation of matter. They themselves do nothing. They have no causal efficacy. And therefore, for Marx, the exact reverse is true of what you would think. You would tend to think, well, you have a certain thought, idea, conclusion, value, judgment, and on that basis, you take a certain action. Marx completely reverses the order of cause and effect here. Your physical actions determine your thoughts. What you do, how you move around, your physical functioning determines the thoughts that flow through your minds. We'll see how this takes place in a minute. So much for just a brief sketch of what is involved in being a materialist. Now a word on why was Marx a materialist. And there are a number of factors here. In part, there was a violent reaction to Hegel's idealism, which set in certain circles of German philosophy during this period. Hegel had dissolved everything, if you remember, in an absolute mind, and in disgust and indignation at this view, there was a whole circle of philosophers that decided to go to what they regarded as the opposite extreme and completely obliterate mind and say everything is simply matter. This, of course, is a complete false alternative. There's no reason to say that everything is either all one mind, a la idealism, or all matter in motion, a la the materialist, but false alternatives are enormously common in the history of philosophy. It's replete with philosophers taking one position and then the other one takes what appears to be the opposite, and then the two argue for centuries. For instance, I think offhand of Heraclitus, remember, who held that change involves a contradiction. There's nothing but change in the world, and he was immediately followed by a philosopher named Parmenides, who said, well, if change involves a contradiction, there can't be any change at all. And he held that the universe is completely motionless and all change is an illusion. And then we went on for some time with this false alternative of everything is change or there is no change, until Aristotle finally set that one at rest. And we've seen the same thing in the theory of universals. Platonic realism, on the one hand, holds that universals are real self-contained entities in another dimension. And of course, you immediately expect the nominalist to say, well, if that's what universals are, there aren't any at all we have is the sense data going by. Well, we have a similar type of situation here. Under the impact of Hegel's violent idealism, we now are going to have a violent upsurge of materialism. a kind of rampant, defiant materialism, eager to show its emancipation from Hegel. You see. You know, to give you an idea of the level to which this materialism descended, I'll give you a quote from Feuerbach, who was a young Hegelian of the period who influenced Marx, and he will indicate to you how far down a materialist can get simply despite Hegel. He was, of course, in rebellion against Hegel's idea that being is the same as being known. Remember that to be is to be an object of consciousness. And he decided to express in the most violent terms he could what would the antithesis of that viewpoint be, what would a materialist viewpoint be. I quote you from Feuerbach, quote, "Being is one with eating. Only in eating does the empty concept of being acquire content. Food is the beginning of wisdom. Do you want to improve the people? Then instead of preaching against sin, give them better food." And then we reach his famous aphorism, "Man is what he eats." And that, of course, in German is a pun, you see. Der Mensch isst, was isst. You see. That's a pun in German. In any event, this is one factor at work here in producing materialism. Another factor is that the Marxists are very eager to be scientific. And ever since the Renaissance, to be materialistic has seemed to many people the key to being scientific. After all, they argue like this. During the medieval period, physics got nowhere. Why not? Because the world was populated with all sorts of non-material creatures, demons and ghosts and spirits and angels and so on, and we couldn't explain the world in simply physical terms by physical law. We had to appeal to all these occult non-material entities. When did physics finally hit its stride and begin to develop? When we despiritualized nature and we took the whole non-material element out of it and said nature is simply matter and motion. Now, physics having adopted that procedure, any number of people began to then, as physics became more and more successful in the modern world, say the trouble with the humanities and social sciences, the trouble with the study of man, is that we still have this hangover of medieval supernaturalism, namely that man has a mind which is different from his brain and physical body. And if we want to be truly scientific, we'll have to do to man what the physicists did to nature, namely completely despiritualize him. Take out all these alleged non-material entities, minds, thought processes, and so on, and construe him simply as matter and motion. This is one type of reason that the Marxists are materialistic. It's a big source of prestige to them to this day to say that they are scientific. They don't believe in the spiritualist viewpoint. And in part, I might mention, materialism formed for Marx the basis for a polemic against religion in general and Christianity in particular, obviously since it was atheistic, you see. Marx interpreted religion, as you know, as the opiate of the masses. Religion, he thought, upheld and rationalized the economic status quo. In effect, the priests and ministers and rabbis tell their congregations, suffer and toil and accept everything. It's all part of God's plan. Don't rebel, and you'll be rewarded in heaven. And therefore, Marx wants to overthrow what he regards as this rationalization of the status quo, and therefore, a materialist metaphysics gives him the handle to launch an assault on Christianity and religion in general. The upshot is that he is an avowed materialist. But now let's look at the other term in his metaphysics. He is a dialectic materialist. And this is to be contrasted with what materialists were prior to Marx. The old-fashioned type of materialists had been what are called mechanistic materialists. Mechanistic materialists. They had held that reality is basically matter and that it operated, it acted in accordance with the laws of mechanics. That's the name, you see, mechanistic materialists. In accordance with the laws of physics. And the typical view had been that reality consists of a number of small physical particles which constantly bombard each other on the model of a number of billiard balls striking each other, and they simply react to the particular force thrust upon them. They act and react according to the pressure and impact physically of any particular situation. That's a mechanistic type of materialist. That is not the Marxist type of materialist. Marx's matter does not operate according to the laws of physics, but according to the laws of Hegel, or to put it another way, according to the dialectic process. It operates, he says, triadically. There's a thesis, which then generates its antithesis, which then is aufgehoben into a synthesis, which becomes the new thesis for a new antithesis, and so on and so on. So you have to think of matter from Marx as evolving or developing in dialectic triadic patterns. That's what, in general, is meant by dialectic materialism. Now, I said that this metaphysics forms the basis for an interpretation of human history. How? Well, we can infer certain things about human history simply on the basis of what we've laid down so far. Since everything is determined, and of course we're led to determinism both by the materialism and by the dialectic process. The dialectic process is a deterministic view of the world. Everything happens inevitably according to the dialectic process. Materialism implies determinism, as we mentioned, so the Marxists are double determinists. But since everything is determined, then of course human history must be determined also. It must follow some inevitable progression, each stage necessarily leading to the next. And moreover, since we know that reality is dialectical, the progression of historical stages must be dialectical also. Human history must operate according to these thesis, antithesis, synthesis patterns. Therefore, Marx is a historical determinist, just as is Hegel. History is inevitably determined by the dialectic law, and there's nothing man can do about it. Each stage inevitably necessitates the next, and so on. So we know that history is determined to follow dialectic patterns, and now we add in the fact that reality is materialistic. We know, therefore, that the forces or factors which determine the progression of human history must, in some sense, be physical or materialistic. It couldn't be, for instance, that human ideas or thoughts or philosophies are the factors behind history, because in a materialistic world, things like thoughts, ideas, and philosophies are just waste byproducts, offshoots without causal efficacy. The question then becomes, what could these forces be that move human history? What sort of forces are physical, materialistic, develop deterministically and dialectically, and determine everything else about human beings? Their thoughts, their ideas, their philosophies, and so on. And in a word, Marx answers economic forces. Economic forces. In the economic life of mankind, Marx finds the key to human history. Economic history, he says, develops through stages. It's determined completely by the dialectic law. We'll see how that operates in a minute. And it is, he thinks, physical enough to qualify under our materialist metaphysics as the key factor in human life and human history. Now you have to understand here what Marx is saying. By economic factors, he means things like this: the nature of the tools of production, the nature of the modes of production. For instance, do you live in a primitive hunting type of society? Do you live in an agrarian society? Do you live in an industrialized society? That's one sort of element involved in economic factor. The tools, the modes of production. Another kind is the kinds of economic trade involved. Do you live in a protectionist society, for instance, or one in which there's international trade? The nature of economic property relations. For instance, do you live in a feudal society, or a capitalistic private property society, or a society where the state owns all property, etc. This is the sort of thing he means by economic factors. And he is saying now that economic factors of this order are the keys to human history. that everything else about man, their thoughts, their philosophies, their ethics, their politics, their artistic tastes, their whole psychological, intellectual life is determined and conditioned completely by the economic structure of the society that a man lives in. It's not, therefore, that your thoughts, your ideas, lead you to adopt a certain economic structure of your society, but, in fact, the complete reverse of that. Now, if you ask me, well, why is it that men adopt one economic system rather than another at a given time, if not because of the ideas they hold? The Marxist answer is that men as such have no choice about the economic system under which they live and are not responsible for that system. The reason for the emergence of one economic system over another at a given time of history is because of the inexorable laws of history, because of the dialectic process. You can think of it in approximately in these terms. There's a collection of blind material forces in the universe run by the dialectic law. They shape themselves continually into different sorts of societies economic. And then the emergence of various thoughts and ideas in the men of these societies is merely a sort of waste byproduct given off in the process. In fact, the Marxist term to refer to men's ideas, they call it men's ideological superstructure. Ideological superstructure, implying, you see, that the foundation, the basis, is economic life, and ideas, thoughts, philosophy, all that is simply something erected on the basis of and as a result of the economic conditions in which you live. Ideas don't determine the course of history, economics does. Now, if you wanted to make up a name for this particular type of determinism, determinism via economics, undoubtedly the most sensible name is the name it's actually called, namely economic determinism is what it's called. If you know the Christian view that everything takes place in accordance with God's will, well, this is like a secularized version of that Christian view, only economic forces take the place of God's will in this view. Everything happens in accordance with economic forces. I'll give you a couple of quotes from Marx illustrating economic determinism. Quote, this is from Marx. Does it require deep intuition to comprehend that man's ideas, views, and conceptions, in one word, man's consciousness, changes with every change in the conditions of his material existence, in his social relations, and in his social life? What else does the history of ideas prove than that intellectual production changes in character in proportion as material production is changed? Unquote. And here's one more clear statement from Marx on economic determinism. Quote, the aggregate of men's productive relationships constitutes the economic structure of society, the real basis on which a juridical and political superstructure arises, and to which definite forms of social consciousness correspond. The mode of production of the material means of existence conditions the whole process of social, political, and intellectual life. And of course, I'll repeat that sentence because that's the key here. The mode of production of the material means of existence conditions the whole process of social, political, and intellectual life. It is not the consciousness of men that determines their existence, but on the contrary, it is their social existence that determines their consciousness. Unquote. Now, those are very clear statements of economic determinism. Now let's pause for a moment and be sure we grasp what that theory involves. Everything is determined by economic forces. That's the real, ultimate explanation of anything a man says, advocates, or preaches. If a man, for instance, believes in, gives arguments for, even writes whole treatises in favor, for instance, of individual rights and political freedom, or in favor of God, or in favor of happy endings in literature, or in favor of a certain architectural style, or it doesn't make any difference what. His real motive in advocating these particular things is not at all what he thinks it is. His real motive is not the particular arguments he puts forth in the whole intellectual case he constructs. His ideas, remember, are merely effects of the particular economic system in which he lives. And his true motive in preaching his ideas, even though this motive may be unknown to him, is to protect and justify his particular economic system. There is, in a word, no such thing as objective, impartial thinking. All thinking on this view is really rationalizing. It's simply the attempt to find theories that will bolster the economic status quo. And this is inherent in human nature. That's the law of human nature, economic determinism. Human beings are incapable of objective rationality. They are inherently, necessarily, unavoidably moved by hidden, secret, economic forces, of which they're usually unconscious, and that explains all of their intellectual activities. For instance, you might give an argument in favor of individual rights and political freedom. You might think you can put that forth as the result of an ethics, which in turn is based on a metaphysics and epistemology. You elaborate a whole complex argumentation, but a Marxist will tell you, what are you really after? What is your real motive in all this? And it's not all this fancy metaphysics and deduction and argumentation and so on. What you're really after, for instance, not there'll be some variation on how a particular Marxist will interpret it, but a characteristic explanation would be, you really are after free trade, economically speaking. Your secret motive is you want to retain free, uncontrolled trade. And why? Because you want to be able to exploit the workers without government intervention. You have an economic stake, an economic motive, you see, at work. And, of course, you disguise this perhaps from yourself also, the Marxists would say, and you elaborate this whole complex philosophy as though that's really your reason for believing in freedom. But, of course, the true reason is not the reason you give, it is your secret economic motive. And there have been historians who have written books, for instance, on the fathers of the American Constitution, and who have claimed that the founding fathers were not at all really moved by the ideas of men's rights, individual freedom, which they talked so much about, but that the fact of the matter is that they happened to be wealthy men and they wanted to protect their own property. And therefore they happened to devise a system whereby those who already had property would be secure, and that's the explanation of the American Constitution. That's a very common explanation offered by Marxists of the American Constitution. Now, if you get adept at this, you should be able to take anything and find, if you look deeply enough, an economic motive. For instance, you're arguing about whether there should be happy endings on television, you know, whether the detective should find the criminal at the end or not. And that's an issue in aesthetics. And suppose you come out in favor of happy endings. You like happy endings. What could be an economic explanation of a happy end, of your desire for happy endings? Now, of course, it wouldn't have anything to do with your aesthetic arguments or your metaphysics, etc. Well, a characteristic, if simplified, Marxist type of explanation would be the capitalists have to keep the downtrodden workers happy. And therefore, if they give them these myths that everything will turn out well at the end, that will appease them and satiate them and keep them quiet for a while. And that's why Perry Mason always catches the guy at the end, you see. I've heard architectural styles explained by Marxists on the basis of economic interpretation of human behavior. For instance, you know, the type of building that Rourke criticized, the excessively ornate building, which is all show and front, whereas the structure, the girders, and so on are hidden. Well, I've heard Marxists say this is a typical capitalist type of building because the useless trimmings get all the prominence and display, and that corresponds to the capitalists, who are the useless parasites, but they get all the featured prominence. Whereas the real girders and structure that keep the building up, the parallel being, of course, the workers, is hidden, you see, and receded in the background, and therefore over-ornamented. That type of classicist architecture simply reflects the economic injustice of society and now projected outward as an architectural style. Now, you just need enough imagination to be able to do this. I don't have to give you more examples. Now, I'd like to point out to you that according to the Marxists, this type of reasoning or this method of thinking is not a volitional dishonesty on the part of the capitalist. It's not that they could know better, but they're trying to, put something over that they could help. Remember, everything is determined, so nothing could have happened differently. On top of which, economic determinism in particular is inescapable. That's inherent in the nature of man in the universe. If you are born in a certain economic system, then you are unavoidably conditioned by that system to think in certain ways. And although your deepest motive is economic, you may not even know that. You cannot help yourself. This is true of any economic structure, no matter whether feudal, socialist, capitalist, etc. All thought is merely subjective rationalization. We're all really moved by economic condition. Now, the Marxists take this to the point of applying it even to the principles of logic itself. They hold the view that what you regard as a principle of logic is itself a function of the economic structure of the society in which you have been conditioned. And they hold, therefore, that since there are many different types of society, there are many logics, a view which is known as polylogism. P-O-L-Y-L-O-G-I-S-M. Polylogism is the view that there is not one fixed, objective, universal set of principles of logic that are binding upon all men, but rather that the very principles of reasoning you use in any process of thinking is determined by the economic system that you live in. So, for instance, the Marxist feature in particular the clash between what they call capitalist or bourgeois logic on the one hand, which is Aristotelian logic, and what they call proletarian logic on the other hand. And proletarian logic is radically opposed to Aristotelian logic, a point to which the Marxists make no bones about at all. They are profoundly opposed to Aristotelian logic, which you could have gathered simply from the fact that they advocate the dialectic process, but polylogism makes it even clearer. Now you see then that if you understand how polylogism is simply an application of economic determinism to logic, you have now got the means to understand how the Marxists will answer ultimately any objection that you raise against their system. Because if you put forth some objection, you say, how do you answer so-and-so? They may at first try to come back with one or two sentences, but at a certain point they'll simply say, look, that's capitalist logic, that's bourgeois logic. If you think in terms of bourgeois logic, then there's no possibility of arguing with you. If we get a hold of you and we condition you economically, then, and you think in terms of proletarian logic, you will then see what the real truth is. But so long as you're the pawn of a bourgeois society, there is nothing we can do for you. So, for instance, if you say to a Marxist, as I have, how do you answer this question? If all thought is simply subjective rationalization, simply a subjective defense of the status quo, is that true of Marxist thought too? Are you yourselves the product of economic conditioning, and you just have to believe your particular Marxist theories because of a particular type of economic system in which you were brought up? Now, of course, the Marxists do not want to say yes to this question for obvious reasons, because it deprived their thought of any claim to universal applicability. And they don't want to say no, because there can't be an exception to the universal law that all thought is simply rationalizing as a result of economic factors. The only answer I have ever heard is to this type of question is that is a bourgeois question. You are using capitalist Aristotelian logic. If you could grasp proletarian logic, you would see that there is no contradiction. Well, that is perfectly logical, I strike that, because there are contradictions in proletarian logic. You would see that it's perfectly logical by proletarian logic to say all thought is subjectively conditioned by economic forces and ours isn't. You can't see that now because you're blinded by these halters of Aristotelian capitalist logic. Well, you see, what it amounts to is the open substitution of ad hominem, the fallacy of attacking a person's character, rather than answering his argument, and we do this now as a matter of philosophic principle. Well, that point, I think, speaks for itself. Now, we've got economic determinism there. Now, we've said that the development of history, therefore the development of economic history, which is the key factor here, moves dialectically. It moves by a thesis generating its antithesis and then a synthesis, etc. What are the units that are going to represent the progression of the thesis and the antithesis? Where are we going to find the thesis and the antithesis in human history? Obviously, we'll have to find it somewhere in the economic life of mankind, since that's the fundamental factor. Where? Well, the Marxist answer is we find it in economic classes. Economic classes. That is, groups of men related by having approximately the same economic level. In every society so far, say the Marxists, there has been two essential groups: the haves and the have-nots. See? And you see how those two are related. Have and have-not are, I see your smile, so you're starting to think in a Marxist fashion. They're related as thesis and antithesis, as A and non-A. One of these is the opposite of the other. And these groups, according to the Marxists, have been constantly opposed to each other throughout history, constantly at war with each other. The rulers and the ruled, the exploiters and the exploited. And societies, according to them, rise and fall according to how the struggle between classes, the class struggle so-called, comes out at any given point in history. The general pattern of human history, put in very generalized terms for the Marxists, would be like this. You have a given society, it polarizes into an exploiting and an exploited class. Some change then occurs, perhaps a revolution, perhaps some fantastic change in the modes of production. The exploited class breaks the chains, wins out over its exploiters. We have a new synthesis of men, a new type of society, which, however, then, subject to the dialectic process, begins to polarize into exploiters and exploited, and then again the new victimized class ultimately throws off its chains and enslaves another group, etc. And thus the opening sentence of the Communist Manifesto: the history of all hitherto existing society is the history of class struggles, unquote. The thesis is some dominant class. That of dialectic necessity generates its antithesis, some exploited class, which then overthrows the preceding dominant class and establishes a new society, a new synthesis of human beings. But a new exploiting group emerges, which is the new thesis, and generates its new antithesis, and so on. Now, the Marxists try to show how this dialectic process operates throughout all the economic changes in past human history. For our purposes this evening, we're going to look only at the present stage. How does the dialectic process of class struggle work out if you live now in a capitalist society? Well, the first thing to observe is that by this theory, capitalism must inevitably perish. That is a matter of dialectic necessity. We have no choice about this, and it wouldn't make any difference if the whole human race went down on its knees and begged to keep capitalism in existence. History guarantees that capitalism must be superseded, because The thesis must give rise to its antithesis. Capitalism, as the Marxists say, contains the seeds of its own destruction. And we're guaranteed this on metaphysical grounds. And this is an article of faith and a source of support to many communists. You know the way in which a Christian, in the face of all reverses, will say, God is nevertheless on my side and he has to come through. Well, a Marxist in similar face of similar circumstances or reversals will say, history is on our side. The dialectic process has to come through. If only you wait long enough, we're guaranteed the new synthesis because that's part of the dialectic process. Well, how in particular will the collapse of capitalism come about? Well, by the dialectic process, the capitalist class, in other words, the wealthy property-owning class, will have to generate its own antithesis. And what will the antithesis of a wealthy property-owning class be? Well, a poverty-stricken propertyless class, which the Marxists call the proletariat. How does it happen that the capitalist class generates a proletariat? Well, the Marxists make many points here of an economic nature which is outside of our province. One of their communist points is to indicate to you is the appeal to monopolies. The idea, you know, that if we had unrestrained, complete laissez-faire, we'd immediately have massive monopolies and all wealth would be accumulated in the hands of the few. They would engage in price wars, cutthroat competition, wipe out small competitors, corner the market, merge, you know, figuring why should I compete with my opponent? We could all merge together, and by this alleged process of progressive monopolization, if we have more and more wealth concentrated in the hands of fewer and fewer people. And meanwhile, of course, the capitalist class, out of a desire for profits, keeps wages at the bare minimum that it possibly can. It extracts every penny it can from the progressively more and more impoverished workers. And of course, once it's squeezed, this is just standard communist stuff that I'm giving you. Once they've squeezed every penny they can out of the domestic market, then they need new markets to exploit. And so they become imperialistic and they start exploiting other countries and shortly impoverish them too and extract all of their wealth. The upshot is a complete polarization of the world. They end up with a few bloated capitalists, the money bags, and a mass of starving proletarians completely deprived of all wealth. And this, you see, is dialectically inevitable given the dialectic process. Well, what happens then? In time, says Marx, and of course with help from the Marxists, the proletariat will become conscious of its plight. It will refuse to swallow the pacifying lies that are constantly fed it by the capitalists, and it will revolt. It will take charge, it'll seize all wealth in the name of the state, and rule the former masters. And this must happen via the dialectic process. You can see it simply enough. Today, according to the Marxists, we have dictatorship of the capitalists. Well, the dictatorship of the capitalists, by dialectic necessity, must generate dictatorship of the proletariat. And therefore, dictatorship of the proletariat is inevitable. Now, notice that the dictatorship of the proletariat requires violent revolution, according to the Marxists. It is impossible to accomplish it except by violent revolution. After all, you cannot expect to reason with the capitalists, even if you put forth powerful arguments to them, assuming there were such as to why they should change their system, give the workers a break, and so on. The capitalists can't help themselves. They're completely not open to discussion. They're economically conditioned. And therefore, the only way out is if at some point we rise up in open warfare, overthrow the existing regime by brute force of arms. Now, I should point out that this is one point at which what are called socialists in America today frequently disagree with the Marxists. Marx himself did not distinguish between the term socialism and the term communism. He used them interchangeably. And of course, the Soviet Union is the USSR, Union of Socialist Soviet Republics. But as the terms are used in America, as of the moment, and they change all the time, but as of the moment, the line is generally drawn like this, that the socialists agree on the end of the Marxists. They agree on the goal, on the type of society we're after, but the people called socialists don't today normally approve of the means of violent revolution. The way it's normally put, the socialists advocate a revolution, and thus the socialists advocate evolution, and the communists revolution. Or the communists say, let's do it by force, and the socialists by vote. So I mention that for what it's worth, but the way the American society is developing now, more and more of the old socialists are in favor of violent revolution, so even this alleged distinction is beginning to crumble. Now, the dictatorship of the proletariat, I may mention, is not yet complete communism. It's only the first stage of communism. It is a completely totalitarian state at this stage. The state is all-powerful. It entirely controls every aspect of every human being's life according to the communist literature. What is the purpose of this stage? This is like the preliminary stage, the anteroom until we reach pure communism. What is its purpose? That is the purpose of the dictatorship of the proletariat, to exterminate all vestiges of the capitalist mentality, to recondition men to become fully communistic in character. How do we achieve this? Well, by one crucial means. We abolish all private property. We institute an economic system in which all property is owned by the state. What any person can do with it is dictated by the state. Each individual is assigned his role by the state for the sake of service to the whole, and no pursuit of private profit will be permitted or be possible. Now, the Marxists simply say, if we have this rigid totalitarian state in which we obliterate private property and the possibility of pursuing private profit, then after a generation or so, this economic conditioning will take hold. Remember, men's characters are entirely determined by the economic structure of the society they live in. Men today have selfish or personal, egoistic desires, say the communists, not because that's inherent in human nature or required by human life, but because they live in a society which has private property. That's the economic institution at the base, and then personal desires, personal goals, personal ambition is the product, the resultant, the ideological superstructure built on that base. Well, they say, what we're going to do in the dictatorship of the proletariat is obliterate the economic base of selfishness, and consequently, after a generation or so, all selfishness will disappear. We'll have a completely new type of man, a type of man whose character, aspirations, and goals are completely dictated by that kind of society. So for the Marxists, you see, there is no such thing as a fixed human nature. Human nature is infinitely malleable. You can make it what you want by putting it in the right economic environment. I may mention, for what it's worth as a historical observation, that part of this theory is that during the dictatorship of the proletariat, you may find certain recalcitrant elements, leftovers from the preceding society, who were too deeply conditioned for the new economic conditioning to take, in which case you simply slaughter. That's part of the theory. You simply slaughter the elements that were too conditioned from the preceding society to be able to react properly to the new economic condition. And thus, when you see each new communist regime take over and immediately engage in the slaughtering purge, they're acting in strict accordance with the theory. All right, we get through the dictatorship of the proletariat. We're now ready for the ultimate synthesis. So far we had a thesis, dictatorship of the capitalist, and an antithesis, dictatorship of the proletariat. Now we're going to have a final synthesis in which the thesis and the antithesis are transcended. There are no longer any warring classes left. Proceeding to our Aufgehoben, we reach a classless society. And a classless society is the pure and final stage of communism. Once we reach this stage, each person has learned to see himself as nothing but a part of humanity. He's lost all personal, selfish concerns and ambitions. He wants nothing but to serve all other men. We have, in effect, what Hegel got last week by different means. We have like a Hegelian superorganism. Remember Hegel's organic state where each individual was just a cell on the body of the state? Well, we have the same thing, just as Hegel advocated. Each individual at this stage comes to see himself only as a cell on the body of humanity as a whole. He wants nothing for himself. What will life be like in this society? On what ethical principle will it operate? I quote you now from Leonard. Quote, the rule of such a society will be, quote, from each according to his ability, to each according to his needs. I continue to quote from Lenin, when people will have become so accustomed to observing the fundamental rules of social life, their labor will be so productive that they will voluntarily work according to their ability. The narrow horizon of bourgeois right, in other words, the translation of that is the egoistical assumption that you have individual rights and you expect to be paid in accordance with your work. That's what he means by the narrow horizon of bourgeois right. The narrow horizon of bourgeois right, which compels one to calculate with the shrewdness of a Shylock whether he has not worked half an hour more than another, whether he is not getting less pay than another, this narrow horizon will then be left behind. There will then be no need for society to make an exact calculation of the quality of products to be distributed to each of its members. Each will take freely according to his needs, unquote. All selfishness will be gone. I've already closed the quote. Everyone will want nothing but to work to the limit of his ability, to serve others who will take what they need, and of course they won't misuse this because they won't want anything selfishly for themselves. I think to give you a description of the communist utopia, the final stage, the best thing to do is read you a brief passage from a neutral commentator which summarizes the essence of what the ideal state would be. This is the second stage of communism now, according to the communists. The individual is not an end in himself, but a means to the self-realization of society of which he is an integral part. He and his fellows, like the cells of a living body, stand in a relation of reciprocity to one another and to the community. All for one, one for all. Each may be the center of a separate life and activity, but each depends upon the others and upon the community for his existence and the performance of his special functions, and each constitutes with the others a single indivisible whole, in whose maintenance and welfare his particular career finds its true self-expression and his proper happiness is attained. Society, then, not the individual, is the real human unit. Hence, human thinking has got to be collective, human action concerted, and human resources pooled if the common good of all human beings is to be attained. In the ideal society, I'm still quoting, individual interests will be reconciled, and all the inequalities of opportunity, wealth, and education, and all the resultant envies and hatreds that have hitherto divided mankind itself will be aufgehoben and overcome. Public interest will absorb and transfigure private interests. Esprit de corps will take up and transubstantiate individual ambition and initiative and become the mainspring of human activity. Nationalism will become internationalism, and human allegiance will be to humanity as a whole throughout the entire world. All men will be comrades, laboring shoulder to shoulder, not each for his own self-aggrandizement, but all for the good of the great community of all mankind, and all will take joy in so doing." Unquote. Now that's a clear description of what the ideal Marxist society is supposed to be like. Now I should point out to you that when we reach, I'll be finished very shortly, when we reach the ideal classless society, the state, according to the Marxists, is going to, quote, wither away. Wither away. That's an article of the Marxist dogma. The state for the Marxists is construed always as an organ of exploitation. The state is an organ of one class to exploit another. The capitalist state, the capitalist class uses it, and so on. Well, if we have a classless society, then we will have no need for exploitation, no need, therefore, for political parties representing different pressure groups, no need for a state. And this Marxist view of the state, of course, is very common today. People will confront you with the idea your only choice is who rules the state, the capitalists or the workers, the rich or the poor. Well, that idea that the state is a vehicle for some group to foist its will on another is a thoroughly Marxist idea, from which it follows that in a classless society, there'll be no state. All decisions will be unanimous. There may be a few stray crooks, but we can discount those. But on the whole, compulsion will no longer be needed. All men will be reconditioned. They will want to do nothing but to serve their brothers. Now, if you ask any questions here about how will the state wither away, since this is going to be a communist society and everything is going to be directed and controlled and economically planned out, who makes the decisions as to what's to be produced and how it's to be produced and who's to produce it and where he's to produce it and who's to consume it and how much he gets, etc. By what steps do we pass from a complete totalitarian dictatorship to the withering away of the state? The communist answer to that question is you cannot understand those things now. You must wait until you are disinfected from the traces of capitalist condition. When you're swept up in the wave of the future, you will then see, when we get there, we will see how it takes place. But at the present stage, we cannot know. Now, I take just a moment to quote from Lenin, who's very explicit on this point. He says, quote, "From the bourgeois point of view, it is easy to declare that such a social order is a mere utopia. It's easy to sneer at the socialists for promising everyone the right to receive from society, without any control of the labor of the individual or citizen, any quantity of truffles, automobiles, pianos, etc. Even now, most bourgeois savants make shift with such sneers, thereby displaying their ignorance. Ignorance, for it has never entered the head of any socialist to promise that the higher phase of communism will arrive. And the great socialists, in foreseeing its arrival, presuppose both a productivity of labor unlike the present and a person unlike the present man in the street," unquote. In other words, we presuppose before we reach this that everything we now know about economic functioning doesn't hold. That somehow, by unspecified means, a mountain of goods will pour, not from heaven, and I guess from Hegel, and that men will be radically different from anything we know about. And if you ask Lenin by what method this is going to happen, I'll quote you one last sentence from him, quote, "By what stages, by what practical measures humanity will proceed to this higher aim, we do not and cannot know," unquote. Well, that's all pretty clear. Now, I think that the moral basis and implications of this whole communist viewpoint speaks for itself. Obviously, the same ultimate moral ideal as Christianity, as Platonism, as Hegelianism, the ideal of altruism and of self-sacrifice. For all of the materialism and the dialectics, for all of the polemic against God, the final result is the same ideal that Christianity, Plato, Hegel, and the idealists held out. And I think after Atlas Shrugged, this speaks for itself and requires no further comment from me. If you remove all of the trappings of this particular philosophy, the altruist morality is what underlies all of it, what supplies its moral goal, the standard by which the capitalists are denounced, the standard by which communism is praised. The dialectical materialism aspect of it, in fact, is just so much window dressing to give the altruist ideal an allegedly scientific versus religious cast. I may say that Marx himself at times indicated as much. He indicated that the question, in certain parts of his writing, that the question of whether dialectical materialism as a metaphysics is true is not really important. The question was, he stated quite candidly at times, whether it worked. That is to say, whether preaching it led to converts to the cause of revolution and the establishment of a completely collectivist, selfless society. And if you read such passages, they're in one of his works known as the Theses on Feuerbach in particular, you will see that Marx admits openly what he's after, and you'll have the clue as to how to judge the truth of dialectical materialism. The truth is that if you want to combat it, you have to combat the altruist ethics, which is what really gives it its popularity and appeal. Now this, I think, you understand. We're late, so I will conclude with the Marxists at this point. Thank you. We have time for just a few short questions this evening. I really will try to be shorter in the lectures hereafter so we can have a more extended question period. Does Schopenhauer advocate universal suicide, the ultimate self-denial as a means to nirvana? Well, in a way, he does, although he's very unclear on this as on all points, but he opposes individual suicide, but he also opposes procreation, sexual activity. So you could say that he does advocate race suicide in that sense. But he doesn't advocate that you should just simply go around and slaughter everyone. The question is, if the will survives human suicide, does it then generate a new being? Let me just read you a passage that is as clear on Schopenhauer as I can make it. I will read you this without comment, and you see if that answers your question. If it doesn't, I can't. We must not forget, this is from a commentator, we must not forget that the will is absolutely free. Having no nature to determine it, it isn't, you see, it's just a process. It is not even self-determined to live and to express itself as it does. Its appearance as a phenomenal world is a miraculous act for which no reason can be given. In other words, the fact that the will comes out as a phenomenal world is in itself an inexplicable mystery. Well, therefore, there is no reason why the will should not, in a similarly miraculous manner, refrain from objectifying itself, dissolve the phenomenal world into nothing, cease to affirm itself, cease to live. There's no reason why it spawned a world to begin with. Well, there's no reason why it shouldn't obliterate a world at the end. The act, then, by which the individual denies the will to live is mystical and spontaneous, arising for no reason whatsoever from something in him deeper than reason, deeper than existence, deeper than willing itself. And then this commentator has the grace to say one last difficulty. Is not the state of a will that has ceased to affirm itself and that has renounced and denied the very activity of willing equivalent to nothingness? Which I said yes in the lecture. He says no. Nirvana, into which the will redeemed from affirmation and willing at last enters, is indeed indescribable in any terms of our finite experience. We have no predicates at hand that we can apply to it, since all categories that we have are drawn from and can be applied only to the phenomenal world. Relatively to anything we can know or perceive or feel or will, nirvana is indeed nothing. And the state of the will that has denied itself and entered nirvana is indeed pure emptiness, but in itself it is not negative. It is a positive bliss beyond all thought and speech. Unquote. If that isn't a clear answer, I'm sorry you can't get a clear answer. Did Schopenhauer claim that it's inevitable that reality will stamp itself out of existence? Not to my knowledge. To my knowledge, he hoped that it would. Who was the commentator on Marx that you quoted? This is from a general history of philosophy by B.A.G. Fuller. It's an encyclopedic, very fair history of philosophy, F-U-L-L-E-R, just called A History of Philosophy, revised edition by, published by Henry Holt. Did Nietzsche ever express his admiration for the great entrepreneurs and or robber barons of the 19th century? Not to my knowledge. I have not read everything he's written, but I know that in general he was scornful of the capitalist system. How does a Marxist explain divergent opinions within one economic system? Well, suppose you take a proletarian and a capitalist. And one is brought up on Sutton Place, and one is brought up on the Bowery. In a broad sense, they live in the same type of system, but obviously they have a different local economic environment. And therefore, the economic factors operating on one are not necessarily the economic factors operating upon the other. So, if we define economic factors narrowly enough, we can find, if there are divergences among people, that there are different local economic circumstances, and that's what accounts for differences of opinion. Does the dialectic process in history stop at the attainment of the pure communist level, or will it generate an antithesis? If so, does Marx state what this antithesis will be? By the law of the dialectic process, communism itself would have to generate some new antithesis, which would lead to a higher synthesis, and so on. And I have heard Marxists say that this is true, that pure communism will not be the final static state. That'll be merely a stage in the endless dialectic process. But they immediately add, we could not possibly imagine, given our present state of knowledge, that is to say, given our present economic circumstances, what that stage after communism will possibly be. All we can know is that the next coming stage is pure communism. What will happen after that? Well, we only think in accordance with our economic circumstances, and until we're in those economic circumstances, we can't even think of the question of what's going to come next. By the way, if you want an example of a Marxist in literature, Lee Hunsaker in Atlas Shrugged was a small character exemplifying Marxism. You remember his view that he couldn't type his autobiography because what could you expect of him when his tool of production, his typewriter, was defective? The idea being he was conditioned by his tools, and no one gave him a chance. When he took over the factory, they didn't give him a chance for the factory to condition his mind properly, and that's why he went bankrupt. Well, that's the Marxist approach. If all men's thought is determined by the economic conditions they live in, how does Marx account for his own thought? Well, I tried to indicate in the lecture he has no possible answer to that question, no possible rational answer. If everything that a man thinks is economically, subjectively motivated, that must be true of the Marxists also. So they are hoist with their own petard. Their own theory is jettisoned by their own theory. In fact, any version of that would say that no human being can be objective, he's really run by forces outside of his control, any such theory is necessarily self-refuting, because it itself cannot be any longer an objective expression of truth, but simply the subjective prejudice foisted on this particular individual by the particular factors operating upon him. So it's a point of broader significance than simply Marxist. You do the same thing with many Freudians who say that all you're thinking is simply rationalizing What really drives you is the id impulses, the drives of your id, which of course is Freud's way of talking about what Schopenhauer and Nietzsche called the will. He is a thorough voluntarist, and the id, this seething cauldron of bubbling irrational drives that everyone is supposed to carry around within him, was the Freudian equivalent of Schopenhauer and Nietzsche's will. In this sense, Freud was certainly a voluntarist and a romanticist. And when his disciples claim that whenever you put forth a theory, we don't have to bother answering your theory, that's just the expression of your basic id drives, they're in the same position as the Marxists are. Their theory is refuted by the same logic. The Marxist seems to be concerned with the virtue of economic equality. What he means by this is equality of the effects, but inequality of the causes. He has products after effects and human action after causes. How does he defend the justice of this latter element? In other words, I gather the question to mean, how do the Marxists defend the view that it is fair that one man should work harder and more productively than another and receive less than another whose needs are greater, but who is paid according to his needs, not according to his ability? And the Marxist answer is simply the ethics of altruism. There is no other answer. They do not confront the question that wealth is created by individual human minds operating to begin with, because they deny that mind has any causal efficacy. For the Marxists, therefore, there's no such thing as intellectual labor. Labor is physical. And therefore, the great creative men, though, the individuals who thought, who worked, who created wealth, don't deserve any credit for that. Wealth is produced collectively by muscular labor and physical machinery. And therefore, to begin with, they would deny that human ability has the significance ascribed to it in this question. But supposing they did grant it, they would simply say this is right because we all have a fundamental obligation to live for others. And the most noble thing you can do from that point of view is sacrifice yourself for others. This is simply straightforward Christianity. And if you ask yourself, how does any advocate of altruism justify the view that you should penalize the able and the productive in favor of the incompetent and the unproductive? And he will tell you, from each according to his ability to each according to his needs, you have an obligation to live for mankind, and he will merely cite that as though it is a self-evident truth. Now, the fact is that communism, for all of its materialism, is simply an attempt to apply in practice the Sermon on the Mount, to put the religious altruist ethics into actual practice here on earth by instituting a society in which everyone sacrifices completely and totally for the rest of mankind. So if you ask, the question is not a particular question for the Marxists, it's for any and all advocates of this viewpoint, and I've never heard any answer that makes any sense in defense of it. Let's take just this last one because it's getting quite late. Could you explain what Nietzsche meant by God is dead? That's open to many interpretations. So far as I can determine, Nietzsche simply meant by that religion is dead. In other words, the belief in God as a cultural force is no longer active, no longer influential. Human beings can no longer expect to live by guidance, by reference to the guidance they derive from God. Nietzsche did not mean that in a literal sense, as some of these simple-minded Protestant theologians today are trying to interpret it as. There are actually some of them, I think they come from Georgia, a number of them, who try to interpret this literally, and they actually hold the view that there once was a God. He was all-powerful and had all the Christian Judaic attributes, all-knowing, all good, all wise, and at a certain point he got sick and died. And so they say, what a tragedy, in effect, God is dead. Now, this, of course, is farcical. If ever there were a God on the Judeo-Christian model, he couldn't go out of existence because being eternal, infinite, unlimited, and endless is part of his very nature. The idea of omnipotent God suddenly, getting cancer or whatever the equivalent would be, is just too farcical to be believed. From this point of view, I have much, much greater respect for an old-fashioned Thomist theologian who believes that there's a God and he thinks he can prove it in reason than for these, in quotes, emancipated atheistic theologians that subscribe to Christianity except they think they can get rid of God because he died. That is not what Nietzsche meant. All right, it's going on quite late, so we'll take our break.
This course continues with Lecture 6.